The neighborhood had always seemed peaceful on the surface. A cul-de-sac tucked neatly behind rows of perfectly trimmed hedges and uniform lawns. At first glance, everything appeared idyllic. But beneath the manicure appearance lay an unspoken code, one enforced by a handful of people who believed they owned more than just their property lines. Among them, none was more notorious than Karen. She had lived on the street for years, positioning herself as the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's standards. Any deviation from the unspoken rules, whether it was a garden that looked too wild, a car parked an inch too far onto the curb, or a wreath that stayed up 1 week too long after the holidays, would catch her attention. And once something caught her attention, it became everyone's problem. When summer rolled around, I decided to host a barbecue in my backyard. It was nothing outrageous, just a simple gathering of family and friends, music playing softly from a speaker and the smell of grilled food drifting through the air. But in Karen's eyes, any gathering larger than a quiet dinner was suspicious. She believed the street should remain pristine, as if frozen in a real estate brochure, untouched by laughter, smoke, or the scent of ribs on a grill. The first hint of trouble came with the way she peered over the fence, her arms folded, lips pursed tightly. The look wasn't unfamiliar. Neighbors had warned me that Karen had a habit of monitoring everyone. At first, I brushed it off. After all, a barbecue was harmless. Kids were playing tag on the lawn. Adults were chatting in the shade, and nobody was causing any damage or disruption. Still, the way she lingered, scribbling notes on a pad, left me uneasy. As the day warmed, the grill sent up plumes of smoke, carrying with it the unmistakable aroma of burgers and steaks. To anyone else, it would have smelled like summer. To Karen, it smelled like an opportunity. She disappeared from the fence only to reappear with her phone pressed against her ear, her face set in exaggerated concern. I didn't have to hear her words to know exactly what she was doing. She was calling the authorities, convinced that the smoke, the noise, or even the gathering itself was some kind of violation. Minutes later, the wail of sirens cut through the chatter. The music quieted instantly, replaced by the low hum of uneasy whispers. 2 police cars pulled up to the curb, lights flashing, and uniformed officers stepped out. For a moment, the entire barbecue froze. The kids stopped running. Parents pulled them closer, and I felt the weight of everyone's eyes on me. Karen emerged from her house, pointing dramatically toward my yard, her voice rising in practiced outrage. The officers moved calmly, asking questions, inspecting the setup, and even glancing at the grill. They checked for any hazards, any violations that could justify the complaint. But as they walked through the yard, it became increasingly clear that nothing was wrong. Everything was legal. The grill was safely distanced. The gathering was peaceful, and the noise level didn't come close to disturbing the neighborhood beyond Karen's exaggerated claims. Still, Karen persisted, waving her arms and insisting that something must be done. Her desperation painted her in a harsher light than she probably realized. The officers exchanged looks, their patience wearing thin. Instead of turning their attention to me, they began focusing on her. They asked her for details, pressed her on her accusations, and eventually shifted the conversation toward her behavior. As they spoke, her tone faltered, and for the first time that day, she looked less confident. By the time the officers wrapped up their visit, the outcome was far different from what Karen had imagined. Instead of issuing me a citation or shutting down the barbecue, they issued her a warning for filing a false report and wasting police resources. The fine that followed wasn't insignificant, and the shock on her face as the paperwork was handed over left the entire gathering stunned. A hush fell over the yard, broken only by the crackle of the grill. Karen stormed back to her house, clutching the notice, her face a mixture of disbelief and fury. The officers left quietly, satisfied that the matter had been resolved, and slowly, the barbecue came back to life. The kids resumed their games. The music started again, and conversations picked up where they had left off. But underneath it all, there lingered a new tension, a sense that this was only the beginning. For Karen, humiliation was not something she tolerated. And in that moment, as she disappeared behind her door, I realized that the fine wasn't the end of the story. It was a spark. The days that followed the barbecue carried a strange calm, but it was a kind of calm that felt fragile, almost staged. Neighbors whispered in driveways and on porches, word spreading quickly about what had happened. Some laughed quietly at the irony of Karen's complaint backfiring, while others exchanged uneasy looks, knowing that someone like her wouldn't simply let the matter rest. In a community where appearances mattered, Karen had suffered a very public embarrassment. And for people like her, humiliation was fuel. Her blinds stayed half closed in the evenings, but behind them, everyone suspected she was watching. The same woman who once paraded around the neighborhood as the unofficial enforcer now kept to herself, at least outwardly. But when she did step outside, whether to collect her mail or to trim her already perfect hedges, her eyes lingered on my house with a sharpness that made it clear she was plotting. It didn't take long before small inconveniences began piling up. Notices started appearing in my mailbox, not from the HOA itself, but from anonymous, concerned neighbors. Each one listed supposed violations: grass that was too long, a trash can left visible, a car parked too close to the curb. At first, I ignored them, chalking them up to petty harassment. But the frequency grew. By the second week, I was receiving them almost daily. The strange part was that none of the issues mentioned were real. My lawn was trimmed, the trash bins were stored properly, and my car was within all regulations. That was when I realized these letters weren't about rules at all. They were about pressure. Karen was trying to suffocate me with paper, hoping the weight of constant criticism would drive me into submission. Yet, she wasn't subtle enough. Her handwriting betrayed her. Sharp, looping strokes that matched the notes she was seen scribbling during the barbecue. Neighbors started noticing too. A few confided quietly that they suspected Karen was behind the letters, and one even admitted they'd seen her slipping an envelope into my mailbox late at night. Word of her obsession began to circulate, and instead of restoring her authority, it only chipped away at it further. Still, Karen wasn't one to back down. Her next move escalated from letters to formal complaints. This time, actual notices arrived from the HOA. Someone had been reporting me for repeated violations, and though the HOA board was obligated to investigate, it quickly became apparent that the claims had no merit. Inspectors came, checked, and left, each time with little to report. But the visits themselves were disruptive, a constant reminder that Karen was pulling strings from the shadows. For every complaint she filed, however, more of the neighborhood seemed to turn against her. Families who had once tolerated her nagging now saw her as a nuisance. After all, her crusade wasn't just against me. It was creating unnecessary tension for everyone. People grew tired of the spectacle, tired of the constant drama she injected into what should have been a quiet street. But Karen couldn't see it. To her, each failed complaint was not a defeat, but a justification to push harder. And when paperwork failed to break me, she shifted her tactics again. Subtle sabotage began to creep in. Trash appeared on my lawn overnight. My mailbox was tampered with, its door left hanging open. Once, a sprinkler head in my front yard was broken clean off, water gushing into the street, until I discovered it the next morning. None of it was ever caught on camera, but the timing and precision left little doubt about who was responsible. The neighborhood, once filled with laughter and weekend barbecues, now felt divided. Some neighbors rallied quietly in my defense, offering sympathy and even small gestures of support. Others stayed silent, either too afraid of becoming Karen's next target or secretly enjoying the spectacle. The tension was palpable, like a storm gathering over the cul-de-sac. And yet, through it all, Karen's house remained the same. Blinds drawn, lawn pristine, her presence a shadow that lingered over every interaction. She had turned the simple act of hosting a barbecue into a battle, one she was determined to win, no matter how far she had to go. What Karen didn't realize, however, was that her actions had attracted more than just neighborhood gossip. The HOA itself had begun to take notice, not of me, but of her. Reports of false complaints, disruptive behavior, and harassment were starting to pile up in their records. Karen thought she was tightening the noose around me, but with every step, she was weaving a case against herself. And as the summer stretched on, the neighborhood waited, watching, knowing that something was about to snap. By the time July settled in, the quiet tension had transformed into something sharper, something impossible to ignore. The neighborhood no longer felt like a row of peaceful homes. It felt like a stage, every driveway and front porch a seat in an audience watching a play unfold. And Karen was determined to make herself the lead, no matter how much it cost her. Her first escalation came during another weekend gathering. This time, it wasn't even mine. A family 2 houses down invited a few friends over for a small cookout, children splashing in a plastic pool, while adults sat around a patio table. Nothing loud, nothing disruptive. But once again, the flashing red and blue lights appeared. This time, the police seemed more reluctant than before, as though they already knew what to expect. Karen stood on the sidewalk, pointing and gesturing with theatrical outrage, claiming smoke, noise, and rowdy behavior. But just like before, the officers found nothing worth citing. They took statements, nodded politely, and eventually turned to Karen with the same weary patience they had shown at my barbecue. The neighbors watched from their yards. The scene so familiar, it was almost predictable. And when the officers left without shutting down the cookout, the family cheered, lifting their glasses as if to toast their quiet victory. Karen, however, stormed back into her house, slamming the door so loudly that the echo rang across the street. The fallout was immediate. For years, Karen had operated under guise of being a protector of the neighborhood, but now her pattern was visible to everyone. What had once been tolerated as vigilance was exposed as harassment. Even those who had previously remained neutral began to murmur their disapproval. The HOA board, already keeping records of her complaints, now had neighbors submitting counter-reports. Testimonies about Karen's harassment began to circulate, painting her not as a guardian, but as a bully. Still, Karen didn't stop. If anything, she doubled down. A week later, flyers appeared in mailboxes, typed up neatly with bold headlines about neighborhood safety and community standards. The language was generic, but the intent was obvious. Each flyer painted gatherings like barbecues as dangerous, noisy, and disruptive to the family-friendly environment of the cul-de-sac. She even cited exaggerated claims of crime, none of which had ever actually happened. At first, a few neighbors laughed it off, but others grew irritated. The flyers weren't just annoying, they were divisive. People began confronting Karen directly, asking her to stop. But instead of backing down, she grew more defiant, plashing the same messages on street poles and even pinning them to the community notice board near the park. The more she pushed, the more isolated she became. The neighborhood no longer saw her as a watchful eye, but as a source of constant stress. Invitations stopped arriving at her doorstep. Conversations fell silent when she walked by. Parents told their children not to play near her yard. She had wanted to be in control of the community, but instead, she was cutting herself off from it entirely. Meanwhile, I tried to live as normally as possible. I hosted smaller gatherings, kept my lawn immaculate, and made sure every trash can was tucked away perfectly. I refused to give her any ammunition, and that only seemed to frustrate her more, because without real violations to point to, she had nothing but her imagination. That was when the letters started again, but this time, they weren't directed only at me. Neighbors began finding envelopes in their mailboxes, accusing them of siding with the wrong people. Some were told they were allowing bad influences into the neighborhood. Others were accused of neglecting their property standards. It didn't matter how trivial the claims were. What mattered was the intimidation. Karen wanted control, and she thought fear would get it for her. But instead of fear, her actions sparked unity. For the first time, neighbors began to organize, not around Karen, but against her. Informal meetings popped up, first in whispers, then openly. People shared their stories, compared their letters, and realized just how widespread her harassment had become. The HOA board couldn't ignore it anymore. They began drafting notices of their own, this time addressed to Karen. Warnings about misuse of HOA resources, reminders about rules against harassment, even potential fines for creating unnecessary disruptions. Each envelope sent her way was another crack in the wall of authority she had built for herself. Still, Karen's stubbornness refused to let her admit defeat. Every letter she received only fueled her conviction that she was a victim, not the aggressor. From her perspective, the neighborhood wasn't turning against her. No, they were being manipulated, corrupted, blinded by rule breakers. And in her mind, that meant she had to fight harder. So she planned her next move. And when it came, it wasn't a letter or a flyer or a complaint. It was something far more direct. The breaking point came on a sweltering Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when the air itself felt heavy, thick with heat and tension. I was in the yard, trimming the hedges and keeping things tidy, when Karen made her move. Unlike before, this wasn't from behind her blinds or through typed flyers slipped into mailboxes. This time, she came storming out her house, crossing the lawn with quick, sharp steps that carried all the weight of months of resentment. The neighborhood seemed to pause, as if everyone had been waiting for this moment. Curtains twitched, blinds tilted, and the quiet hum of lawnmowers and sprinklers stilled. Karen didn't bother with pleasantries or disguises. Her fury was written across her face. Her hands waved in harsh gestures as she accused me of everything from smoke pollution to lowering property values. She wasn't just upset about barbecues anymore. She was angry about everything. My garden, my guests, even the way my porch light stayed on a few minutes longer at night. It wasn't conversation. It was a performance. And she wanted an audience. Neighbors stepped onto porches, some with folded arms, others simply curious. The same people who had once endured Karen's gossip in silence were now openly watching, and she knew it. But instead of feeling embarrassed, she raised her voice louder, making sure everyone heard her tirade. I kept calm, refusing to escalate. My restraint only seemed to fuel her further. She leaned in close, her words sharp, her finger jabbing toward my house as though every brick and shingle was an offense. And then, in her desperation to push me into reacting, she made a mistake. She crossed the property line. Karen's foot landed firmly in my yard as she continued her rant, and in doing so, she gave the neighborhood something undeniable: trespassing. No amount of twisting words or dramatic gestures could hide the fact that she had left her property and invaded mine in a fit of rage. The gas from the neighbors carried across the street, and in that instant, the balance shifted. Phones came out. Cameras recorded. Karen, so used to being the one controlling the narrative, didn't realize until too late that she was now the spectacle. Every word, every step, every accusation was caught in real time, and the audience she had craved was no longer on her side. When the police arrived, called not by Karen this time, but by multiple neighbors, the scene was already documented. Officers approached calmly, listening to both sides, but the evidence was overwhelming. Video showed her crossing onto my property, her voice raised, her accusations flying. The officers didn't need to search for proof. It was right there, replaying on screens held by neighbors who had grown tired of her antics. This time, the fine wasn't just for wasting police resources. It was for harassment and trespassing. The officers explained it clearly, their tone professional but firm. Karen tried to argue, tried to twist the story into one where she was a victim, but her words fell flat. The cameras didn't lie, and the neighbors weren't willing to back her up. When the citation was handed to her, she froze. The same woman who called the cops on everyone else, who had issued complaint after complaint, now found herself on the receiving end of legal consequences in front of the very community she had tried to control. Her hands shook as she clutched the paper, her face a mix of fury and humiliation. Without another word, she turned sharply and stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her so hard that the sound echoed across the cul-de-sac. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't awkward. It was liberating. Neighbors smiled. Some even clapped softly, as though the moment had lifted a weight off the entire street. For the first time, Karen had been confronted not just by one person, but by everyone. But as satisfying as it was to see justice delivered, I knew Karen wasn't done. People like her never admitted defeat. She might have been fined, embarrassed, even caught on camera, but her pride was too deeply rooted to let it end there. And as the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, casting long shadows across the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was already planning her next move behind those tightly closed blinds. The battle wasn't over. It was only changing shape. In the days after the trespassing incident, the neighborhood experienced a fragile peace. The kind of peace that feels less like resolution and more like the stillness before another storm. Karen's blinds stayed drawn tighter than ever. Her car remained in the driveway, and not once was she seen on her daily walks of inspection. To some, it looked like she had finally been humbled, but to those who knew her patterns, it was clear she was simply recalibrating. The first signs came quietly. Streetlights near my house began flickering, sometimes staying dark for entire nights. Mail went missing, not just mine, but from several neighbors who had spoken out against her. Packages were delayed or delivered open, their tape peeled back as though someone had pried inside. None of it was enough to prove anything, but all of it pointed to one source. Then came the noise. In the dead of night, when the street should have been calm, loud thumps and metallic clatters echoed from Karen's property. Some thought it was construction. Others whispered about deliberate disturbances meant to keep us awake. On more than one occasion, Car alarms blared mysteriously outside her house, only to stop as soon as lights flicked on in surrounding homes. It was harassment through disruption, a silent retaliation that left everyone restless. The neighborhood began to fracture under the strain. Some argued that ignoring Karen was the best approach, that attention was her fuel. Others believed stronger action was needed, legal, official, permanent. The HOA board found itself under pressure, with meetings growing more heated as residents demanded accountability. Each complaint filed against Karen only thickened the case against her, but the process was slow, and Karen knew how to exploit every delay. Meanwhile, her own behavior grew stranger. Cameras appeared along her fence line, pointing not at her property but outward toward ours. Motion lights flashed on at the slightest movement, bathing the street in harsh brightness at all hours. She claimed it was for her safety, but to us, it felt like surveillance, a constant reminder that she was watching. One night, the conflict reached a new level. A family across the street, one of the few who had openly celebrated when Karen was fined, woke to find their driveway covered in raw eggs. Dozens of them, smashed and dripping, leaving a stench that lingered even after hours of cleaning. Though no one saw it happen, suspicion fell squarely on Karen. And for the first time, voices in the neighborhood stopped whispering and started speaking loudly, openly, angrily. By then, the HOA board could no longer ignore the unrest. They scheduled a formal hearing, one that would address the long list of complaints, the fines, the evidence of harassment. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the entire community reclaiming peace. Notices went out to every household, and the date was set. Karen was required to attend. As the day approached, tension thickened. Some neighbors prepared statements, ready to present their experiences. Others gathered photos, saved copies of flyers, or held on to video clips of her trespassing. It was as though the whole cul-de-sac had transformed into a courtroom, and everyone was determined to have their say. Karen, however, saw the hearing differently. To her, it wasn't accountability, it was war. She began pacing her front yard again, muttering to anyone within earshot about conspiracies, betrayal, and how the neighborhood had turned rotten. She made calls, loud enough to hear through open windows, to supposed contacts in legal circles. Whether those contacts were real or imagined, no one knew. What we did know was that she was preparing for a fight. The night before the hearing, a storm rolled in. Rain hammered rooftops, thunder shook the street, and yet through it all, Karen's lights blazed. Shadows passed across her windows, restless and agitated, as though she spent the entire night pacing and plotting. The neighborhood slept fitfully, knowing that the next day would decide more than just fines. It would decide whether Karen's reign of intimidation would finally end. When morning broke, the rain stopped, but the storm hadn't passed. It had simply shifted indoors, to the community hall, where the hearing would take place. The community hall buzzed with energy unlike anything the neighborhood had felt before. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly, neighbors settling in with quiet determination. Some carried manila folders stuffed with printed emails, photos, and notes. Others clutched their phones, videos queued and ready to play. The HOA board sat the front behind a long table, their expressions tense but resolute. And then the doors opened. Karen walked in as if stepping onto a battlefield. Her chin was high, her lips pressed into a tight line, and a stack of papers clutched in her arms like a shield. She avoided eye contact with the crowd, but her posture screamed defiance. For years, she had commanded fear and compliance on that street. Now, every face in the room was turned toward her, not with respect, but with weary anger. The hearing began with order, the board carefully outlining the process. Complaints would be heard, evidence reviewed, and a decision made. But it didn't take long for the cracks in Karen's composure to show. Neighbors took turns standing, their voices steady as they described months, sometimes years of harassment. One by one, they laid their experiences bare. The late-night noise, the false complaints, the flyers, the sabotage. Some spoke calmly, others with trembling frustration. Every testimony painted the same picture, a neighbor who had overstepped again and again, poisoning the peace of the entire community. Evidence followed, photos of flyers, screenshots of emails, videos of Karen trespassing, pointing, shouting. Even the police reports were read aloud, each citation reinforcing the growing weight of her misconduct. Through it all, Karen scribbled furiously on her papers, her face reddening, her foot tapping against the tile floor. When her turn finally came, she launched into a tirade. She spoke of declining standards, of irresponsible neighbors, of how she alone had tried to preserve the beauty and order of the street. Her voice rose higher with every word, her accusations spilling into wild claims of conspiracies and targeted persecution. But unlike before, no one was cowed. No one nodded along. The board listened, stone-faced, while the neighbors shifted in their seats, unimpressed. And when her rant finally wound down, silence followed. Not the silence of agreement, but the silence of finality. The board deliberated only briefly before delivering their decision. Karen would face heavy fines for harassment, false reports, and repeated violations of community rules. In addition, she was formally stripped of any ability to file further complaints without documented evidence, a measure designed specifically to prevent her from weaponizing the system again. The words hit her like a blow. For years, Karen had wielded complaints and rules as her weapons of choice. Now, those weapons were taken from her hands. She tried to argue, her voice rising again, but the gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the board declared the hearing closed. Neighbors exhaled collectively, the tension breaking like a storm finally passing. Some smiled, others exchanged relieved glances. For the first time in months, it felt like the neighborhood had reclaimed itself. Karen, however, didn't smile. She gathered her papers with shaking hands, her face pale but her eyes burning with unspent fury. Without a word, she stalked from the hall, her footsteps echoing against the linoleum floor. The door slammed behind her, leaving a hush in her wake. In the days that followed, Karen withdrew completely. The blinds on her house stayed shut. Her yard fell strangely quiet, and the stream of letters, complaints, and disruptions finally stopped. The street, once divided by her constant meddling, began to heal. Barbecues returned. Laughter floated through backyards, and neighbors who had once been wary of speaking up now found solidarity in their shared victory. For me, the memory of that first barbecue still lingered. What had begun as a simple summer gathering had spiraled into months of tension, conflict, and community upheaval. Yet, in the end, it was the very thing Karen tried to destroy, our sense of togetherness, that ultimately defeated her. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen had called the cops on my barbecue, determined to shut it down. Instead, she ended up fined, exposed, and stripped of her power. And as smoke from a fresh round of burgers drifted across the cul-de-sac one sunny afternoon, the neighborhood felt lighter, peaceful, united. Karen's blinds remained closed, but beyond them, her silence said everything. The reign of the self-appointed enforcer was over,